Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into George Orwell's political and economic views. Here is what you will get in this video. How a young imperial policeman in Burma began questioning the machinery of power. How the cold math of unemployment and class in Depression Britain sharpened his sense of justice. How the Spanish Civil War taught him what happens when ideals meet secret police and party discipline. And how those lessons echo whenever states promise fairness but end up rationing truth. Stay with me, because the journey from empire to Spain will make the rest of Orwell's thinking click. Let's start with Burma. In his early 20s, Orwell served in the Indian Imperial Police. Picture the job as a daily lesson in who can order whom, and who must pretend not to see. He later described moments that felt like moral whiplash. He stood with the badge of the empire, yet he felt the cost of keeping that badge clean. He saw that coercion does not only press down on the colonized, it also twists the person who carries it out. That realization does not arrive with a trumpet blast. It arrives in small humiliations, in the sense that public lies require private silence. If you want to understand why Orwell became suspicious of large systems that need everyone to nod along, start here. Now move to Depression-era Britain. Orwell goes north to live among miners, unemployed laborers, and families squeezed by rent and coal bills. He watches budgets that come down to ounces and pence. He sees how policy sounds neutral on paper but lands differently in a cold kitchen. Means tests, charity rules, the price of food, the distance to work. These are not abstractions. They are incentive structures that tell people what is safe to admit, where to queue, when to hide pride. He comes away convinced that any serious politics must defend dignity and truth at the same time. Help the poor, yes, but do it without creating a new class that must flatter inspectors to survive. That tension between justice and control becomes one of his lifelong themes. And then Spain. Orwell volunteers to fight the fascists and joins a militia in Catalonia. At first he sees something remarkable. Ordinary people trying to run parts of a city on new rules, with old class markers set aside. The energy is real. So is the confusion. War is logistics before it is slogans. Trenches need food, boots, and clear information. Over time he watches another force gather behind the lines. Party officials, arrest lists, newspapers that decide which facts are allowed to exist. He is wounded in the neck and barely escapes the purges that follow. Spain teaches him a hard lesson. A movement can speak the language of equality while building an apparatus that fears unapproved truths more than enemy bullets. Once that habit sets in, production falters, rumors replace reports, and people learn to say what keeps them safe rather than what keeps them honest. Put Burma, Wigan, and Barcelona together and you have the core of Orwell's lens. Power without accountability corrupts the truth. Systems that depend on silence will always struggle to allocate effort and resources well. And ordinary people, when trusted, can organize more than elites expect, but they need protections for speech and conscience or the experiment collapses under fear. That is the soil from which all his later work grows. Not a theory first, but a memory of how it felt to live inside systems that rewarded obedience over candor. Hold that picture. The policeman's badge. The miner's ledger. The militia trench. Each scene tests the same question. Who controls the flow of information, and what do people have to do to stay safe? If you keep that question in mind, the rest of Orwell's political and economic views will make sense as we move forward. What did Orwell actually stand for, in his own words? He said his serious work was against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism, as he understood it. That phrase matters. Democratic, because the means are as important as the ends. Socialism, because a decent society should not leave whole classes of people trapped by poverty, illness, or inherited disadvantage. Put them together and you get a standard he kept returning to. A politics that guards civil liberties while tackling economic injustice. If either side collapses, the whole project fails. Let's unpack the term without slogans. Democratic, for Orwell, meant plural parties, a free press, and the right to criticize the government without fear. Not as window dressing. As a working system of checks that keeps power honest. It meant independent courts, the ability to organize unions and associations, and the routine, sometimes messy business of changing leaders without violence. In other words, truth must be protected institutionally, not just wished for. Now socialism as he understood it. Not a blueprint for a perfect society, but a commitment to raise the floor of life. He wanted ordinary people to have enough food, health, and education to stand upright and speak plainly. He saw that destitution bends the spine and the truth at the same time. If your children are hungry, freedom of the press can sound like a luxury. So he insisted that a fair share of national income go toward basic security, because only then can freedom be used rather than admired from a distance. Here is the crucial distinction. Orwell's democratic socialism stood at a deliberate distance from the one-party command systems of his century. He saw how central authorities, once insulated from criticism, begin to manage not just the economy but the facts themselves. When a plan faces resistance from reality, the easiest lever to pull is language. Reports are softened. Targets are met on paper. The numbers move, but the shelves do not. He judged that a politics willing to punish inconvenient truth will eventually punish inconvenient people. That is not a path to justice, even if it travels under that name. So how do you keep the moral core without sliding into coercion? Orwell's answer was deceptively simple. Preserve the places where truth can survive pressure. Newspapers that do not need permission to investigate. Opposition parties that can argue and win. Courts that can say no. And an electorate that can throw the rascals out. These are not accessories to an economic program. They are the oxygen the program needs to avoid becoming a machine for excuses. Think of it as a balance of guardrails and goals. The goals are social dignity and wider opportunity. The guardrails are free inquiry, lawful limits on state power, and genuine competition for office. Remove the goals and you get cruelty disguised as efficiency. Remove the guardrails and you get comfortable lies disguised as compassion. Orwell's point was that a decent society must walk and chew gum. It must expand the circle of material security while keeping the state answerable to those it governs. There is also a temperamental note here. Orwell distrusted grand theories that explain everything and cannot be falsified. He preferred facts that bite back. Wages, prices, ration sizes, waiting lines, arrest statistics, bylines that disappear from newspapers. These are the grains of sand that jam the gears of propaganda. Democratic socialism, as he practiced it on the page, was less a doctrine than a habit. Test claims against lived evidence. Protect the eccentrics who say awkward things. And when the data fail to match the speech, fix the policy, not the ledger. You might ask, can such a balance hold under pressure? Orwell's life taught him that pressure is precisely when you need it most. War, depression, political fever. Those are the moments when leaders are tempted to trade liberty for unity and truth for morale. He argued the trade rarely pays. Once the habit of silencing begins, information quality drops, and with it the ability to coordinate production and trust. A society that cannot say what is wrong cannot put it right. So when you hear the phrase democratic socialism in Orwell's voice, hear a double demand. Make life fairer in concrete ways, and never give any office, party, or plan the final word on reality. The test is not whether the rhetoric is inspiring. The test is whether ordinary people can criticize, organize, publish, and vote without fear while the society still moves resources toward the bottom. If yes, we are closer to what he meant. If no, we have kept the label and lost the meaning. Think of this as a to-do list written under air raid sirens, not a dream of a perfect future. In The Lion and the Unicorn, Orwell lays out a practical wartime program designed to win a total war and level the social playing field enough to keep morale, production, and trust intact. First, nationalization of the commanding heights. Land, mines, railways, banks, and the major industries that keep the whole machine moving. Why gather them under one roof during war? Because scattered ownership can mean scattered priorities. Coal must arrive when the factories need it, not when it is most profitable for an individual pit. Trains must move according to strategy, not shareholder calendars. Central control here is not about ideology so much as logistics. If the front depends on steel, electricity, and transport, then those arteries must beat to the same pulse. Second, a hard limit on incomes, the famous 10-to-1 idea. Not because envy is policy, but because class bitterness is expensive. A country that asks conscripts to risk their lives cannot afford a home front where visible luxury mocks ration lines. Cap the spread and you buy unity. You also change incentives. When the race for status cannot be won with sheer income, the social signals shift towards service, competence, and courage. This is not the abolition of incentives, it is the reweighting of what a society chooses to admire under stress. Third, democratize education. In a crisis you need the whole talent pool, not only the sons and daughters of a few schools. Opening pathways through scholarships, technical training, and fairer exams is not just a moral gesture. It is a production plan. Wars are won by mechanics, logisticians, coders in today's terms, nurses, radio operators, and foremen who can learn fast, improvise well, and lead small teams under pressure. If your education system sorts by birth signal more than by ability, you will misallocate the one resource you cannot buy in a pinch: competence. Fourth, imperial reform. A country that claims to fight for freedom cannot run an empire on 19th-century rules without tying itself in knots. Bringing colonies toward equal partnership or independence is not only just, it removes a standing contradiction that drains credibility and cooperation. In war, allies prefer allies, not masters. Align the map with the message, and more doors open. You can hear the pattern. Each plank aims at the same bottlenecks: coordination, morale, and legitimacy. Who decides where resources go? How do you persuade millions to work beyond exhaustion and still believe the sacrifice is shared? And what story lets a people look itself in the mirror at 3 in the morning and say, yes, this is worth it? Notice what this program is not. It is not a utopia with a timetable. It is an emergency architecture. It assumes scarcity, error, and the need to adjust. It tries to keep the levers of power close to the evidence: coal output, rail tonnage, calorie counts, casualty rates, hours worked. The ambition is simple: remove obvious sources of friction and resentment so the nation can think clearly and act quickly. Did parts of this vision happen? In the years that followed, Britain nationalized key sectors, put the central bank under public control, expanded schooling, and unwound much of the empire into independent states. Not because Orwell snapped his fingers, but because the pressure of events pushed policy toward some of the same conclusions. The point for us is the logic behind the list. If you want a society to survive a storm, you tighten the ship, assign duties clearly, and stop rewarding the behavior that sinks morale. There is one last thread to pull. Programs like this succeed or fail on information quality. If production targets are honest, you can steer. If they are massaged to flatter a department, you will steer into fog. That is why even a wartime plan aimed at equality and victory still depends on truth. The moment truth becomes negotiable, trains arrive on time only on paper, and the front discovers too late what the reports were afraid to say. Picture Barcelona in late 1936. Streetcars painted red and black glide past shop fronts that now say collectivized. Waiters and tram drivers call one another comrade. Titled forms of address are out, practical cooperation is in. Wages are flattened, union cards function like authority, and committees handle everything from bakeries to barbers. It is messy, hopeful, and oddly efficient in places where habit and pride do more work than a manager's whistle. For a moment you can believe that ordinary people, given trust and room, can run a city under bombardment. How does it function day to day? Start with the simple tasks that keep a city alive. Bread, boots, buses. Workplaces elect delegates who coordinate shifts and supplies. When a bakery runs short of flour, the committee knows before the rumor mill does. Tram repairs get prioritized because moving people and material matters more than polishing office brass. There are still bottlenecks, of course. Fuel is scarce. Skilled mechanics are in trenches. But you can feel a real, bottom-up attempt to make incentives line up with survival. The payoff is tangible. Where pride in craft is strong, service continues. Where confusion is thick, patience and improvisation substitute for paperwork. Now look beneath the surface. War is logistics multiplied by uncertainty. A city fighting for its life needs ammunition at dawn, milk at breakfast, and a clear picture of what broke yesterday. In a decentralized arrangement, information flows horizontally. People tell the truth more easily because the person who can fix a problem is often across the table, not behind a distant desk. The upside is honest feedback. The downside is that improvised systems struggle to scale beyond the neighborhood. You can allocate bread by committee. Coordinating artillery shells, uniforms, hospital supplies, and rail timetables becomes harder when each fix is local. Enter the new mood in 1937. Central party control tightens. Ministries absorb functions that neighborhood committees had handled. Newspapers begin to sound uniform. You might hear that a phone exchange must be secured for the war effort. You might also notice that those who staffed it are the same people who now find themselves treated as obstacles, not colleagues. The shift feels subtle at first. Credentials matter more than competence. Permission replaces initiative. Before long, some groups become untouchable and others become suspicious by default. Arrests begin to do a kind of economic work. They do not only remove alleged traitors. They also send a message about which facts you are allowed to report. If a warehouse is short, the safer story is that it is full and merely delayed. If a factory misses a target, the safer number is the one that avoids a committee's anger. The city still moves, but the feedback loops that kept the early experiment honest begin to clog. People learn a new survival skill. Say the thing that keeps you out of trouble. Production follows speech. When truth is risky, maintenance is late, and breakdowns multiply in silence. This is where factional names matter less than the pattern. Parties aligned with centralized control put their own people into key posts. Independent unions and militias that had carried weight on the streets are told to fold into a unified command. Some comply out of discipline, some out of exhaustion, some out of fear. The result is predictable. Experiments from below shrink, even where they worked well, because they embarrass the argument that only one plan can save the city. The space for honest difference narrows, and with it the space for trial and error. What began as a collective effort to keep lights on and trams running turns into a contest for who may define reality. Consider the human response. In the early months, a mechanic might stay late to cannibalize parts for a tram because the neighborhood depends on it and his name means something at the depot. Under the new rules, that same mechanic may wait for a stamped order because stamps, not results, now determine who gets blamed. Initiative, once a virtue, becomes a liability. People mark time. Whisper networks replace notice boards. Black markets quietly supply what official channels cannot admit is missing. Was the early experiment perfect? Not even close. Coordination was uneven, amateurism expensive, and war punishes romantic plans. But what deserves attention is the hinge. When the apparatus of control grows faster than the flow of reliable information, the system may achieve political unity while losing economic traction. A city can survive disagreement if it retains the habit of truth-telling. It cannot survive long if every correction feels like disloyalty. So Spain, in this slice of experience, offers a stark lesson. Bottom-up energy can keep essential services alive under fire. Top-down suspicion can smother that energy even as it promises order. The promise was simple. Centralized to win. The betrayal was quieter. In the name of unity, the very mechanisms that carried honest signals were degraded. And without those signals, planning becomes guesswork, and guesswork becomes doctrine. If you want to know where a system is failing, listen to its words. When the language gets hazy, the map gets hazy, and people start walking off cliffs they can no longer see. Orwell argued that bad prose is not just ugly, it is a symptom. When speakers hide behind vague phrases and cushion everything with abstract nouns, they are telling you something about the incentives around them. Clear language is risky in a culture that punishes bad news. So the words go soft first, and then the decisions follow. Think of euphemism as a kind of anesthesia. It deadens the pain signals that would normally make a society pull its hand back from the stove. Civilian deaths becomes collateral damage. A shortage becomes a temporary dislocation. Debasement becomes adjustment. Each swap buys a little comfort and sells a little information. The invoice comes due in misallocated resources. If a report says the lines are short when the lines are long, the supplied trucks do not reroute. People wait. Engines idle. Repairs slip. Now consider the middle of the chain. A supervisor knows that speaking plainly will trigger a reprimand. What does that supervisor do? He learns to write reports that pass rather than inform. He moves verbs into the passive voice. Mistakes were made. Targets were nearly achieved. Responsibility evaporates into grammar. Once that habit sets in, the feedback loop that keeps complex systems honest begins to fail. The numbers may look tidy. The shop floor tells a different story. There is a quiet economics here. Information is a scarce good. When it is priced too high in personal risk, people substitute safer signals. They give praise instead of data, slogans instead of logs, forecasts instead of inventories. The result is predictable. Decisions drift away from reality, and scarce inputs are sent to the wrong places at the wrong times. You do not need a grand theory to see it. You only need to watch how a muddled memo becomes a missed shipment, which becomes a broken schedule, which becomes a day's production lost. Partisanship adds another twist. In Notes on Nationalism, Orwell shows how loyalty to a team can make honest counting feel like betrayal. If you are grading your own side, the temptation is to round every number up and every criticism down. The mind learns a new arithmetic. 2 plus 2 is still 4 in private, but in public the sum depends on who benefits. Over time that habit teaches people to ignore inconvenient measurements, and a society that ignores measurements will end up guessing at reality. Guesswork makes for dramatic speeches. It does not make for good logistics. So what is the antidote? Orwell's answer begins with craft and ends with courage. Use concrete nouns. Prefer short words. Name the actor. Say who did what to whom. If something failed, say it failed. If a policy hurt, say where and how. Plain speaking does not solve scarcity, but it gives you the only reliable tool for managing it, an accurate picture of where the pain really is. And it reshapes incentives. When honest reporting is praised instead of punished, the whole system gets better at seeing itself. Budgets improve. Maintenance is timely. People fix what is broken instead of inventing new words to explain why it looks fixed. Ask yourself a simple test the next time you hear an official statement. Could you draw the event from these words? Could a quartermaster load a truck based on this description? If the answer is no, then the language is not just unhelpful, it is anti-helpful. It stands between the problem and the person who can solve it. That is the practical morality at the heart of Orwell's argument. Truthful language is not a frill for the humanities, it is the nerve system of a working society. When language decays, incentives decay with it. People learn to survive by phrasing, not by performance. And once that lesson spreads, the cost appears not only in the ledger of truth, but in the ledgers of food, fuel, and time. The first duty, then, is to make it possible to say what is happening, in words that mean what they say. Only then can a society coordinate at scale without lying to itself. 2 laboratories let us watch planned economies from the inside. One has animals who talk. The other has people who are told to stop. Animal Farm and 1984 are not policy papers. They are field notes dressed as stories. They let us see what targets, rations, and statistics feel like when a small group has the last word on truth. Start with Animal Farm. Listen for the moment when production numbers begin to float away from meals. Squealer announces that output has risen again. There is more grain, more eggs, more of everything. The animals look at the buckets and see less. How can both be true? They can be true when the numbers must flatter the plan. The barn wall becomes a bulletin board for victory. The yard becomes a place where ribs show. This is not just satire. It is an economic mechanism. When careers depend on success, the easiest thing to adjust is the report. Watch the milk and apples. They are reserved for the pigs because, we are told, the pigs need brain food to manage the farm. A privilege is framed as a sacrifice. The rule is simple. Those who coordinate are too important to suffer the same shortages as those who lift. You can almost hear the rationale in any era. The managers cannot be distracted by hunger. Give them the extra calories so they can think for everyone. It sounds efficient. It grows a class that is insulated from the feedback everyone else feels. Now look at the windmill. It stands for a plan. It will solve problems. It will power the future. The animals build. The walls fall. They build again. Each cycle consumes more labor while rations quietly shrink. When the collapse happens, the cause is always the enemy. Sabotage. Traitors. A storm. Never a miscalculation. The lesson is less about bricks and more about incentives. In a system that cannot admit error, failure searches for a scapegoat. The scapegoat is cheaper than a correction. Law begins to change shape. The commandments on the barn wall are edited at night. A small phrase appears that makes yesterday's memory fit today's need. No animal shall sleep in a bed becomes no animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets. The form of law remains. Its content becomes elastic. Contracts and promises lose their bite. When rules are reversible by those who benefit from the reversal, markets and morals both lose their price signals. You cannot plan your work when the law moves to protect the powerful. Move to 1984. The Ministry of Plenty announces an increase in the chocolate ration. Citizens cheer. Yesterday's newspaper recorded a promise of 30 grams. Today the ration is 20. Winston's job is to rewrite yesterday so that the promise matches the cut. Now ask the practical question. How would a quartermaster plan deliveries in a world where yesterday changes on command? The answer is that he would guess. Guessing stands in for coordination when records are not allowed to be stubborn. Goods degrade into symbols. Victory gin. Victory cigarettes. Victory mansions with plaster that flakes onto the bed. Names announce abundance. The senses report something else. Queues lengthen. Razor blades disappear. Boots do not fit and then do not exist. The system cannot improve because the mechanism for discovery has been replaced by a mechanism for praise. When nothing can be said to be broken, nothing can be fixed. You do not need a spreadsheet to understand the effect. You need a line outside a shop. War becomes a kind of background machine. Floating fortresses and distant fronts absorb resources and attention. Shortages can be blamed on the enemy without end. The lottery keeps hope alive among the poor, but the winners are invented. Savings are redirected into ritual. The economy is managed by managing what people can check. As long as they cannot check, the announcements work. For a time, both stories use the same lever. Control the story, and you can delay the cost of bad policy. But delay is not forgiveness. The bill returns as hunger, shoddy goods, and work that produces headlines instead of repairs. Once people learn that accuracy is dangerous, they protect themselves by speaking in safe phrases. Safe phrases are cheap. Useful information is expensive. Scarcity gets worse. Ask a few test questions as you listen to any claim of success. Can the numbers be audited by someone who can say no? Do the people who set the targets eat the same rations as the people who meet them? Can a correction be announced without fear? If the answers are no, then the plan is running on applause. Applause does not ship grain. It only sounds like it does. Animal Farm and 1984 endure because they show how command systems try to replace honest prices and honest speech with decrees and announcements. The farms and ministries in these books do not fail for lack of intelligence. They fail because the truth becomes a political risk. Once truth is a risk, the trucks drive to the wrong warehouses and the shelves fill with words. Centralization always arrives with good promises. We will coordinate better. We will be fairer. We will move faster because the left hand will finally know what the right hand is doing. On paper it looks beautiful. One plan, one ledger, one chain of command. What could go wrong? The interesting part is not the intention. It is the machinery of consequences that follows once all the dials live in one room. Start with coordination. A central office can see the whole network of rails, mines, farms, and factories. It can, in theory, allocate where the need is greatest. But how does that office know where the bottleneck actually sits at 4 in the morning? It does not live on the loading dock. It lives inside reports. If the cost of reporting bad news is high, the information you receive will be comforting rather than true. Meetings will be calm, shipments will be late, and the plan will glide gracefully over the potholes it refuses to admit exist. Coordination becomes choreography. It looks synchronized from the balcony and slips on the stairs. Now consider fairness. Centralization often promises to ration burden and benefit more evenly. Same rules, same rations, same queue. The first weeks can feel like moral renewal. Then the exceptions begin. A hospital requests extra fuel for ambulances and gets it. Sensible. A ministry requests extra fuel for important meetings and gets it. Less sensible. Pretty soon the rule is still equal, but the exemptions multiply in ways that track status more than need. People notice. Once they believe that rules bend for insiders, they stop volunteering crisp facts to a system they expect to ignore them. That small change in trust has a price. It shows up as longer lines, hidden hoarding, and a quiet search for side doors. Speed is the next promise. Decisions from one desk rather than 20. But speed depends on who is allowed to say stop. In a decentralized setting, a foreman can halt a production line to fix a fault because the person who suffers if the fault spreads is nearby. In a centralized setting, the safest move is often to keep the line running and write a memo up the chain. If the memo returns stamped too late, the defect is already in the crates. The system moved quickly in the wrong direction because the authority to pause lived far from the moment it was needed. What looks like efficiency from the top can feel like helpless momentum at the bottom. Targets deserve their own paragraph. Set a target for output and you will get output. You may also get thinner goods, skipped maintenance, and creative counting. If the target is kilometers of road laid, expect long straight stretches where few people live. If the target is tons of nails, expect a mountain of nails too heavy to use. The behavior is not mysterious. When survival at work depends on hitting a number, people learn to feed the number. They do not wake up plotting to deceive. They simply respond to the rule that rewards them. Over time, the target replaces the purpose it was meant to serve. What about stability? Centralization promises to end chaos, factionalism, and duplication. It often succeeds at ending visible disagreement. But disagreement is where error goes to get corrected. When dissent is awkward or dangerous, error must find a different exit. It slips out through the back door of reality. Machines break without warning. Warehouses empty without notice. Rolling blackouts arrive on schedules no one will print. From afar, stability looks achieved. Up close, people learn to live by rumor. And then come the unplanned markets. Whenever official prices and quantities do not match need, another system quietly appears. Call it the back staircase. A driver knows a baker who knows a clerk who can find a bag of flour if you can find a bottle of something rare. These exchanges do not bloom because people are wicked. They bloom because information and incentives need a place to breathe. The black market is a kind of diagnostic tool. It points a finger at the precise places where the plan cannot hear the facts. If the response is to punish symptoms rather than fix the cause, the symptoms move and the cause remains. Bureaucracy grows as a side effect of trying to be fair and thorough. Each exception needs a form. Each form needs a review. Each reviewer needs a supervisor. None of these people start with bad intentions. But they face a powerful incentive: avoid blame. Avoid blame by requiring signatures. Avoid blame by moving decisions to committees. Avoid blame by insisting on perfect compliance before action. The system becomes excellent at proving that any problem is not its fault. It becomes slower at solving problems no one is allowed to own. There is also the human problem of insulation. If the people who decide rations do not live with rations, they will not feel the cost of being wrong until very late, if at all. This is not a moral condemnation. It is a feedback problem. Pain travels poorly through layers of carpet. A minor shortage for a minister is a night without dinner for a nurse. Once those two experiences diverge, the urgency inside the office clock and the urgency at the queue no longer match. Decisions will reflect the clock that ticks loudest. You might ask, do we gain nothing from centralization? Of course we gain something. In emergencies, a single coordinating hub can redeploy trains and fuel faster than a haggling marketplace ever could. The point is not that centralization cannot work. The point is that it has characteristic failure modes. Information grows timid. Targets become games. Exceptions eat rules. Bureaucracies protect themselves. And the people who most need the truth learn that truth is the noisiest way to lose a job. So what keeps the promises from becoming outcomes you did not order? The pattern we have watched suggests a few guardrails. Make it safe to deliver bad news. Keep some power local enough that a person who sees a problem can fix it without a permission slip. Audit numbers with people who can say no. Tie privileges to performance that others can verify. And do not confuse applause for demand. Applause is free. Deliveries are not. Centralization, then, is best treated like a strong medicine. Use it when the patient is in shock, monitor the side effects obsessively, and taper the dose as soon as you can. The danger is not that plans exist. The danger is when plans take the place of perception. When that happens, the trucks drive beautifully according to the schedule and arrive smilingly at the wrong address. Here is the tightrope Orwell tries to walk. Make a country fairer without dulling the spark that makes people try hard. He wants dignity for people who live close to the edge. He also wants room for craft, ambition, and excellence. If you flatten too much, people stop reaching. If you flatten too little, resentment eats cooperation. The question is not ideology. The question is human behavior. Think about his income idea, the famous 10-to-1 range during an emergency. Why put a ceiling at all? Because symbols matter in a crisis. If nurses and miners queue for rations while a few households glide past shortage, the story of shared sacrifice does not hold. A visible upper limit tells the country that nobody gets to float above the storm. It reduces status theatre that would otherwise drain trust. Trust is not poetry. Trust is productivity. People work longer and share information more freely when they believe the game is not rigged. Now turn the coin over. A cap can also backfire if it snuffs out legitimate motives. People care about money. They also care about mastery, reputation, and the chance to build something that lasts. A society that refuses to recognize extra effort will slowly teach people to give the minimum. The trick is to protect the floor while leaving many ladders. You can celebrate and reward excellence with honors, responsibility, and the chance to lead important work. You can keep financial rewards meaningful within a range that does not split the nation into castes. You do not need to choose between dignity and drive. You need to design for both. Orwell's criticism of privilege cuts in two directions. He disliked the casual entitlement of old money that turned labor into scenery. He also distrusted the new entitlement of officials who claim virtue as a job description. The first can buy its way past rules. The second can write its way past rules. In both cases the pattern is similar. The people who decide do not feel the consequences of being wrong. That is not an argument against expertise. It is a reminder that expertise needs friction. Exposure to reality keeps smart people honest. How do you keep motivation alive while pushing society toward fairness? Start by making advancement legible and earned. People will accept limits at the extremes if the path in the middle is real. Scholarships that actually reach poor students. Promotions that can be won by performance rather than by family or party. Training that helps a talented worker pivot into a higher skill job without asking permission from a patron. If those channels are open, the feeling of possibility replaces the feeling of futility. Possibility is fuel. There is also the quiet economy of respect. Wages measure one thing. Standing measures another. When a mechanic, a teacher, or a nurse feels that their work carries public honor, money is not the only signal that matters. Orwell keeps returning to this moral arithmetic. If a society pays lip service to essential labor while showering comforts on those who live far from risk, it is building a resentment tax that will be charged later in low morale and silent sabotage. If it treats essential labor with open respect and fair pay, it earns a dividend in effort, pride, and candor. Beware of counterfeit equality. Equalizing outcomes by paperwork while creating a second set of doors for insiders will not calm a country. People can spot the difference between fairness and choreography. Real equality makes it less costly to tell the truth. Fake equality makes it more costly because any complaint threatens the story. If the complaint threatens the story, the complainer becomes the problem. That path ends in quiet fear, which is the enemy of honest work. So the balance looks like this. Give every person enough security to stand upright and speak plainly. Preserve strong reasons to excel, to solve hard problems, and to take responsibility. Make sure the people who set rules feel the pinch of those rules. Keep recognition tied to verified contribution, not to connections or slogans. Get those ingredients roughly right, and you do not need to preach about motivation. You will see it in the numbers that are hardest to fake. Turnover drops. Maintenance improves. Innovation appears in corners where it never did before. That is the equality Orwell was trying to reach. A platform for dignity that still leaves room to climb. Here is the challenge with Orwell. Everyone wants him on their team. Free speech advocates quote him. Critics of inequality quote him. Opponents of surveillance quote him. The result is that Orwell turns into a mascot, and mascots do not argue back. If we want to read him honestly, we have to let him keep his full shape. He is a writer who holds two commitments at once. Economic justice that lifts the floor of life. Civil liberty that protects truth from being managed. Drop either half and you are not reading Orwell. You are recruiting him. So how do we keep the shape? Start with method, not slogan. Orwell did not worship theory. He watched how policies landed on actual bodies and bank books. He asked whether people could say what was broken without fear. He looked at queues, rations, arrests, and newspapers with missing names. That habit is portable. We can use it on any system we live under. When a policy claims success, ask two questions. Who can safely say it failed? And what changed when they tried? Next, treat free expression as an economic input, not just a moral ornament. The ability to publish bad news is a supply chain issue. If mechanics cannot report a fault, the bus fails on Monday. If statisticians cannot publish a decline, budgets miss on Friday. If a journalist cannot print a pattern, the public learns too late. This is not about scoring partisan points. It is about whether the system has working warning lights. Orwell's point is that a society that punishes true alarms will end up proud and unprepared. Read the fiction as fieldwork. Animal Farm and 1984 show what happens when targets outrun truth and language is bent to spare authority embarrassment. Do not stop at the symbolism. Ask the boring but decisive questions that a quartermaster or nurse would ask. Who verifies the numbers? Who decides the rations? Do the people who set quotas stand in the same lines as the people who meet them? If the answers drift toward the invisible and the insulated, expect shortages of courage first and of goods later. Resist the temptation to cherry pick. If you admire markets, listen when Orwell warns that private privilege can harden into a class that floats above consequences. If you admire social insurance, listen when he warns that official virtue can become a shield against criticism. He is not asking us to choose our favorite purity. He is asking us to build arrangements that keep fact stubborn and power answerable while we widen the circle of material security. Here is a practical reading kit you can carry into any debate. When you hear a promise of fairness, look for the mechanisms that handle exceptions. Exceptions reveal who counts. When you hear a promise of efficiency, look for the permission to pause or correct. Corrections reveal whether truth outranks schedule. When you hear numbers, look for the auditors who can say no in public and keep their jobs. Auditors reveal whether reality gets a vote. Finally, remember tone. Orwell's voice is sharp, but it is not sneering. He assumes the audience can handle hard facts if they are stated plainly. That is the model for reading him today. Skip the applause lines. Hunt for the measurable claims. Track how incentives shift when speech becomes risky. And notice where ordinary people are trusted to organize their own work without asking permission from those who neither load the truck nor stand in the queue. If you read him that way, he will not validate your team. He will make you a better observer. Here is the cleanest way to hold what we have learned. Systems that monopolize information eventually end up monopolizing incentives. Once truth passes through a single gate, rewards and punishments start to line up with whatever keeps that gate happy. It does not happen with fanfare. It happens with 1,000 small decisions about what to write in a report, what to print in a paper, which target to praise, and which shortage to rename. Over time, the economy begins to follow the grammar. Plans stop bending to reality and reality starts bending to plans. And when that flip happens, outcomes obey the logic of the paperwork rather than the logic of need. Now reverse the lens. Decentralized checks are not mere ideals. They are economic inputs. A press that can publish bad news on Tuesday prevents a factory disaster on Friday. An opposition party that can humiliate a minister in parliament today keeps the rail schedule honest next month. Auditors who can say no without losing their jobs make budgets real. These are not just virtues for textbooks. They are part of the production function of any society that wants to coordinate without self-deception. There is a moral dimension hiding in the mechanics. When people are free to tell the truth without being punished, they do not only fix problems faster. They keep their dignity. They stand upright. They speak clearly. And that clarity creates a feedback loop that strengthens both liberty and competence. The country becomes better at aiming its compassion because it knows where the pain actually is, not where the speech rules say it should be. So here are the questions to take with you, the ones that keep the conversation honest. What safeguards keep your preferred system truth tracking when it is under pressure? Not on a calm day, but on the day of scandal, shortage, or war. Who is allowed to publish the sentence that ruins a meeting but saves a city? Where do emergency powers end? Who writes the off-ramp into the law so that yesterday's necessity does not become tomorrow's habit? And when a plan fails, what lets a leader lose face and still stay in the room long enough to fix it? Also ask the test that a quartermaster would ask. If a number matters, who audits it? If a rule hurts, who feels it first? If a privilege exists, who can revoke it, and how quickly? If your answers point to people who stand in the same lines as everyone else, you probably have a system that can correct itself. If your answers point to insulated rooms, the correction will likely come late, wrapped in a euphemism, and paid for by someone who never saw the memo. One more thought before we close. The choice is not between heartless competition and heartless control. The live question is how to build arrangements that insist on honest signals while widening the circle of security and opportunity. That is the thread running through the lives at the center of this story. The miner who wants fair pay and straight talk. The mechanic who will stay late if initiative is rewarded rather than punished. The writer who knows that a page of plain words can rescue a town from a beautiful falsehood. If this has given you a clearer way to see the link between truth, incentives, and power, use it. The next time you hear an announcement of success, ask who could safely say otherwise. The next time you hear a promise of fairness, look for the exceptions. The next time you see a target, follow it back to the warehouse and ask what changed on the loading dock. Those small questions are how citizens keep their systems from drifting into self-flattery. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy thoughtful and entertaining history, like this video, leave a comment with the moment that surprised you most, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. Explore the other episodes if you want deep dives that respect your intelligence and make the past useful in the present.